In the 1880s, there was a simple way to tell how long a man had worked on the railroad. You counted his fingers. From the 1830s through the end of the century, American railroads connected their cars using something called the link and pin coupler. Each car had an open pocket at both ends. To join two cars together, a brakeman would stand between them, hold up a heavy iron link, guide it into the pocket of the approaching car, and drop a pin through a hole to lock it in place. That's it. An iron pocket, a forged link, and a pin. And to make it work, a man had to stand directly between two rail cars while one of them was rolling toward him. He had to time the link placement perfectly. Get it wrong by half a second in either direction, and the approaching car would either knock the link from his hands or catch his arm between the drawbars. Get it wrong by a full second, and his body would be pinned between 20,000 pounds of rolling freight with no way out. And it wasn't a job you did once. In a busy switching yard, a single brakeman might couple and uncouple cars dozens of times in a shift. Every single time, he put himself between those moving walls of wood and steel. But even perfect timing couldn't save you if the equipment was wrong. And it was almost always wrong. There was no industry standard. Different railroads used different sized pockets, different sized links, different mounting heights. So a brakeman could do everything right. Step in at exactly the right moment. Line the link up perfectly. And the coupler on the other car would be 2 inches too high. Now he's stuck between two closing rail cars, fumbling with a piece of iron that doesn't fit. On top of all of this, literally on top of it, the same men were responsible for braking the train. Before George Westinghouse's air brake became standard, the only way to slow a freight train was for brakemen to run along the roofs of moving cars, in rain, in snow, in pitch darkness, turning the brake wheels by hand. These brakemen weren't just doing one dangerous thing on the railroad. They were doing 3 dangerous things, all shift, every day, on equipment that was working against them. And the railroads had the paperwork to prove exactly how bad it was. In 1889, the Interstate Commerce Commission started counting. It was the first time anyone had formally tracked how many railroad workers were getting killed and injured on the job. The results were worse than anyone had publicly admitted. Out of roughly 700,000 railroad employees in the United States that year, more than 2,000 were killed, and over 20,000 were injured. For every 35 men working on the railroad, one of them would be hurt badly enough to be officially reported before the year was out. For every 300, one would not come home at all. And those were the injuries that made it into the reports. Railroads had every incentive to undercount, and brakemen, terrified of losing their jobs, learned to keep quiet about anything short of a missing limb. Missing fingers were so common among coupling men that they became a kind of dark shorthand. You could tell how long a brakeman had been at it by looking at his hands. 3 fingers on one hand meant he had been working the yards for a while. Most of his fingers still there meant he was either very new or very lucky. None of this was a secret. The casualty reports were public. The funerals were constant. Every railroad executive in America could see exactly what the link and pin coupler was doing to their workforce. But the coupler was cheap. It was already installed on hundreds of thousands of cars, and replacing it would cost a fortune. So the math was simple, at least from the boardroom. Dead and injured brakemen were cheaper than new equipment. The courts made sure it stayed that way. If a brakeman got crushed between 2 cars and somehow survived, he had almost no legal recourse. Judges routinely ruled that the man had assumed the risk the day he took the job. If another worker's mistake played any part in the accident, the railroad owed nothing at all. So the men kept dying in the switching yards. The railroad companies kept writing it off, and nobody with the power to change it had any reason to try. But the solution already existed. It had been sitting in a patent office for over 20 years, invented by a man who had never worked a single day on the railroad. Eli Janney had never worked on a railroad in his life. He was a dry goods clerk running a small shop in Alexandria, Virginia, a former Confederate soldier trying to piece together a living after the war. But his shop was near the rail yards. Janney had spent enough time watching brakemen work the couplers to understand something that the railroad executives apparently could not. The men were not the problem. The equipment was. So he designed a replacement. Instead of an open pocket and a loose iron link that required a man's hands to guide it into place, Janney created a coupler with two interlocking knuckles. When two cars were pushed together, the knuckles would rotate and lock into each other automatically. The brakeman did not have to stand between the cars or reach into anything. The cars coupled themselves. Uncoupling was just as simple. A brakeman lifted a lever on the side of the car. The knuckle opened. The cars separated. He could do the whole thing standing to the side, completely clear of the rails. Janney filed his first patent in 1868 and kept refining the design, securing an improved version in 1873. His original prototype was not machined in a factory. He carved it out of a block of wood on his store counter, shaping the knuckle between customers. Railroad engineers who tested the design admitted it was superior to the link and pin in every measurable way. And then, almost nothing happened on America's railroads. By the 1880s, the American railroad network stretched over 150,000 miles of track, operated by hundreds of competing companies, running hundreds of thousands of individual railcars. This was an industry that had spent the previous 2 decades just arguing over how wide the track should be, coordinating a system-wide coupler conversion, pulling cars out of service, buying parts, hiring labor, all at the same time, across all of those companies, was not going to happen voluntarily. No single railroad wanted to go first and eat the cost while their competitors kept running cheap link and pin equipment. A few railroads ran trials. Some quietly adopted automatic couplers for their passenger cars, where a high-profile wreck might make the newspapers and scare off customers. But the freight cars, the ones the brakemen actually coupled by hand dozens of times a day, stayed exactly as they were. A clerk in Virginia had solved the engineering problem in 1868. 15 years later, men were still losing their fingers to the same device his invention was designed to replace. The railroads were not going to change on their own. Someone was going to have to make them. Lorenzo Coffin had no connection to the railroad industry. He was a farmer from Fort Dodge, Iowa. And the only reason he ended up in this story is that one afternoon, he happened to be standing on a train platform at the wrong moment. A brakeman was coupling 2 cars. Coffin watched the man step between them, reach for the link, and then heard the sound of his hand being crushed between the drawbars. He saw the blood. He heard the scream. And from that moment, Lorenzo Coffin could not leave this alone. What shook him wasn't just the injury. It was finding out that this was happening every single day, in every rail yard in America, and the companies running those yards had known for years. One afternoon on a train platform turned an Iowa farmer into the most persistent railroad safety advocate the country had ever seen. For the next decade, Coffin made himself impossible to ignore. He testified before state legislatures. He showed up at industry events uninvited and confronted railroad executives in front of their peers. He wrote letters to every newspaper and politician who would listen, and plenty who wouldn't. By most accounts, the man was relentless to the point of being genuinely annoying, and he did not care one bit. If you are learning something from this video, hit subscribe. I cover forgotten American machines and industrial history every week. Now back to the story. But the railroad lobby was one of the most formidable political machines in Gilded Age America. These companies employed hundreds of thousands of workers, moved the nation's freight, and had financial ties to half the members of Congress. When Coffin pushed for a federal law mandating automatic couplers, the industry mobilized against him, and they nearly won. The bill stalled on Capitol Hill. Legislators who privately supported the reform would not risk crossing the railroad money. For years, it looked like Coffin's crusade was going to die in committee. But Coffin was not alone. The Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen, one of the earliest rail labor unions, threw their weight behind the cause. Other reformers joined. And the thing the railroads could not control started working against them: the small-town newspapers. By the early 1890s, too many small-town papers had run the same story. Too often, a local boy was mangled or killed in a rail yard while doing a job the railroad could have made safe years earlier. The families of those boys had fathers, neighbors, and congregations who voted. And one by one, the congressmen who had been hiding behind the railroad lobby started doing the math on their own re-elections. 25 years after Eli Janney filed his first patent, and nearly a decade after Lorenzo Coffin watched a brakeman's hand get crushed on a train platform in Iowa, the fight was over. On March 2, 1893, President Benjamin Harrison signed the Safety Appliance Act into law. It was one of the first federal laws in American history to tell an entire industry how it had to treat its workers. And for 1893, what it demanded was radical. All railroad cars involved in interstate commerce had to be equipped with automatic couplers and continuous air brakes. The link and pin coupler, the device that had been grinding through the hands and bodies of American brakemen for over half a century, was effectively banned. Railroads were given until January 1st, 1900 to comply. The railroads complained. They asked for extensions. They dragged their feet. But for the first time, the law was on the side of the men doing the dying, and it held. Across the country, shop crews began pulling the old link and pin assemblies off freight cars and bolting Janney-type knuckle couplers in their place. Hundreds of thousands of cars, one at a time, year after year. By the turn of the century, the conversion across America's railroads was largely complete. The casualty reports from the Interstate Commerce Commission told the story. In 1893, the year the law was signed, over 1,500 railroad workers were killed on the job, and tens of thousands more were injured. Within a decade of full adoption, coupling-related deaths and injuries had been cut by an estimated 60%. Thousands of men, every single year, who would have been crushed or mangled under the old system, were instead going home at the end of their shifts with their bodies whole. Brakemen who had spent entire careers expecting to leave pieces of themselves in the rail yard could now do the most routine part of their job without stepping between moving freight. The era of the link and pin coupler was over. Walk into any freight yard in America today, 130 years after the Safety Appliance Act, and watch how the cars connect. Two knuckles interlock automatically. A lever on the side releases them. The same basic design Eli Janney carved out of wood over a century ago. The metallurgy is better now. The tolerances are tighter, the steel is stronger, and the engineering has been refined by more than a century of use. But the fundamental idea, the one Eli Janney carved from a block of wood on his store counter in Virginia, is still the thing holding American freight trains together. Janney earned a modest living from his patents. Nothing close to the fortunes amassed by the railroad barons who spent decades fighting to keep his invention off their freight cars. Lorenzo Coffin went back to his farm in Iowa after the Safety Appliance Act passed. The law he fought a decade to create barely gets a paragraph in most history textbooks. Neither man's name means anything to most Americans today, But their fingerprints are on every freight car that rolls across this country. A clerk saw a problem the entire railroad industry refused to fix and solved it on his store counter. A farmer watched one man's hand get crushed and decided that was enough. Every brakeman who went home with 10 fingers instead of 7 owed something to both of them.